Hi, and welcome to the set of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. We're excited to share with you a preview of a few of the upcoming episodes starring the best-selling authors in the world that you'll see in full this winter.
He was a very great editor, and the Americans had a slight problem, Simon and Schuster, in the sense that they topped the auction. They went to auction, and they'd paid 3,200,000 40 years ago, and they suddenly said, nobody's heard of him. And I'll show you, if I may, Jake, to prove what they thought of me and what they thought of the title in those days. It's the first book out, and I consider this, what I'm about to show you, a legendary. I've had publicity people and arts people say this is one of the best covers the game has ever seen. But what you will see is how important they thought Jeffrey Archer was.
Wow.
I got stuck on the bottom almost by mistake. Gain and Able changed my whole life. 1 million copies in the first week. I went from literally being penniless overnight.
I was at college. I was interested in postmodernism and that kind of postmodernist criticism, and I thought, I'm going to give this guy a name that means puzzle. And a rebus is a picture puzzle. It's a way of sending a message through little drawings with letters added or taken away. And when I was growing up as a kid, there was a newspaper and it had a kind of cartoons and stuff for kids to do. And they had a rebus. I didn't know that's what it was called, but it had a rebus in it every week, which I really enjoyed doing. So I gave him the name, thinking I'm only going to use this guy for one book. It's a little in joke. It's something that people who appreciate literary criticism and postmodernism will enjoy. I think I gave him the first name John, by the way, because of John Shaft, who was one of the first detectives I really liked. When I was a kid, I wasn't old enough to be allowed in to see the movies, the Shaft movies, but nobody stopped me buying the cheap paperback books. So I had all the Shaft books by Ernest Tidyman sitting on my shelf as a kid. So it's not true that I didn't read any crime fiction. I did read some, but it was mostly stuff from Hollywood movies. And then quite a few years later, I was in a bar in Edinburgh and I was introduced to a guy called Joe Rebus, a real person who lives in Rankin Drive in Edinburgh. That's the street he lives in. It's a complete coincidence. And he told me it was a Polish surname. So after that, I had Rebus's backstory. And it kind of chimed as well, because after World War II, a lot of Poles did move to the UK and a lot of them moved to Scotland. So Rebus's family came from Poland, but I didn't discover that until about book number 11 or 12 in the series.
Oh, well, I think he was there for a long time before I wrote him. There was this ambition to write, and you write, or you should write what you want to read. Your first reader is yourself. And there I was, totally under the spell of Hornblower. And it occurred to me sometime in my 20s that it was very odd that there were several guys writing novels about the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic Wars, and nobody had done the same for the army, and yet there were extraordinary stories to be told there. And so I thought, well, that's a gap on the bookshelf. And I kept looking for those books. I kept haunting bookshops, waiting for someone to come along with the stories of Hornblower on land, and they didn't. And then one day a dim light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, well, why don't you do it? So he was there for a long, long time. And then finally I decided to try.
The thing behind the Molly series was that Constable Evans was beginning to annoy me a bit. He is a good chap. He was the sort of man you'd want to bring your daughter to bring home and say, this is who I'm going to marry. You'd say, oh, good choice. But he was a little too meek for my mind. He, when his superiors were rude to him, he didn't say anything back. He sort of walked away. And I thought, I want someone who's a little more feisty than this, who doesn't always know when it's wise to back off or to shut up. Someone who's a lot more like me, I have to say. I did get sent out of the classroom in school with monotonous regularity for speaking up when it wasn't my turn. And so I wanted a woman too. I wanted a feisty female.
Jemima's story was really my story, and really how I felt. I also think that Jemima as a character had a sweetness that was really relatable. She was just a good person, and she wanted just a very simple life and wanted to be seen. And I think just so many women related to that, and young women. And I still get letters from 12-year-old girls, you know, young teens and pre-teens, because so many of us feel that we're just not enough. And that's really what Jemima is about. It's about a woman who doesn't feel enough, who then realizes that it's okay to not be enough. You can still go for the things that you want.
It comes out of the blue, and it took me about 1 second to say yes. But there's a big difference, because everybody thinks of the movies, and in a way Fleming's novels, which were largely written in the 1950s, have sort of been forgotten because the movie franchise is so gigantic and global. It's rather obscured Fleming's novels, which are, you know, he's not a very good writer, Fleming, one has to say. And some of the James Bond novels are really creakingly bad. But how many writers create a mythic persona, you know, like Sherlock Holmes or Alice in Wonderland or James Bond? You know, Fleming did it. And so, you know, kudos to him, as they say. But my task was quite simple as I saw it. I was going to completely ignore the movies, completely. Even though I've worked with 3 of the actors who played James Bonds, I decided to, they've all been in films of mine, Brosnan, Connery, and Daniel Craig. I decided to completely forget the novels, the movies, and I went back to Fleming's novels and I read them all. There are 14 books, 2 short stories collections as well, in chronological order, taking notes. And I then had to, you're given this gift of James Bond, the character, and you have total freedom to do, you have to respect the traditions of the novels, but you can do anything you want, invent your own story, your own setting, etc., etc.
I'm definitely there picturing the scene when it happens. It's very visual for me. Although I don't really see their faces. I don't, so they're kind of like, I see the setting, I'll see, like, I don't know, the house or the trees or the street that they're walking down, but they're kind of faceless, shadowy, faceless figures. Especially if I'm writing from their point of view, because I'm kind of looking out through their eyes. I'm not like looking in a mirror and seeing what they look like. But I'm there and I kind of hear their voices.
We said in the introduction to the book, we explained that there's a degree of reconstruction has gone on. And when there were these sort of maybe week-long gaps, we'd have a look at, I'd look at where he was in the schedule, say, Nikki, do you remember anything about playing Tennessee that day? And he might remember something, but 90% of it was there.
At that point, a meeting was arranged between me and the Christie family. And at first we were all approaching it very cautiously, but the more we talked about it, the more excited we got by the possibilities. And I think the Christie family were, more than anything else, reassured to see how big a Christie fan I was. I think their concern about doing something as unusual for them at that point as commissioning a new book was that maybe some new writer would get involved who would be kind of wanting it to be more about them. And as soon as I started talking about Agatha and how much I love traditional Poirot, and, you know, I said things like, I wouldn't change him. He is absolutely Agatha Christie's Poirot. If I were to write this book, I would see it as my job to bring a new and interesting case to him, but he would absolutely remain the traditional beloved Poirot. And everything I said convinced them that I was a genuine major fan of Agatha. And, you know, we didn't agree on the spot, but, you know, they went away and thought about it. And after a couple of months, we just thought, well, yes, we will take the plunge. And, you know, that was 4 books ago. I've now recently just published my 4th Poirot novel, and there's a 5th one due to come out 2023.
Well, his name came from an old school friend, Banks. And the character came more from my reading than anything that I'd actually seen done or observed. A little bit of May Gray, perhaps a little bit of Ruth Rendell's Inspector Wexford, Adam Dalgleish. You know, those people were, at least in the early 80s, you know, they were going quite strongly. And I thought I'd like to do something like that set in my part of the world, which Reginald Hill had a series set in Yorkshire, but there wasn't a lot of stuff set there. So I thought I'll invent a detective and a sidekick and just have them go at it. And that's how Banks really started.
And that's something that happens quite a lot in my books, is that I have, a deus ex machina. I don't know how you would say it if you were a Roman. Deus ex machina, the absent person that holds the narrative. You get it in with Mistress Beldown in Harvest. You're going to get it in my forthcoming book Eden, in which there's a young woman who disappears in the first pages and doesn't show up until the last, with everything that happens because of her absence. So it's just kind of a trick that I guess I've fallen in love with, without being too aware of having fallen in love with. But very often these things show up and job again because you use them as a crutch. So Otto was just me thinking how amusing it would be to have the power, to have the battery behind the narrative absent from the page.
Well, I was sitting in my agent's office in the autumn of 2014, discussing what I was going to do next, fiction-wise, and we were discussing a trilogy of novels on Richard III and the fall of the Plantagenet dynasty in the 15th century. And I'm sitting there thinking, do I want to really live with Richard III for the next 3 years? And suddenly this idea came to me: 6 books on the wives of Henry VIII. It was one of these eureka moments. And I thought, oh, I would just love to do that. That would be the perfect project for me. So I suggested it to my agent, and his face just lit up. I've not forgotten that. And he said, I know which of these 2 series I can sell. And he said, leave it with me. And there were 3 publishers interested. So it was a very exciting time. And I mean, I thought first of all, that there had been too many books on the 6 wives. And I thought, no, publishers are going to say, no, the market is crowded. And also I thought nobody will commission 6 books from me, but they did. And in America, they commissioned 10 at one time, because that was, I was doing this concurrent series on England's medieval queens. So it's, as I say, it's really exciting autumn.
It's that, what anchors it, I hope, is that backstory, is what is Parker? What is he? Because clearly there's something very odd going on. There's something odd going on with his daughter. What is she? What is this ultimately moving towards? And I've often thought, I kind of have, I know what the last chapter is.
You do?
Yeah, and I've known for a while, and I keep thinking, although I always feel it's then God will go, well, if you write that, I'm just going to kill you, because you have no reason to stay around. But I've often thought, maybe just in case a safe lands on my head, or I get hit by a falling piano, or whatever it might be, that I should write it, because I think there will be an answer to this. There will be an explanation for what, I think the explanation, why it's him, why he's the one why these cases come to him and not to somebody else. There is a reason for it.
It was my first novel, The French Executioner, and I'd been thinking about writing novels for ages. I'd written a few plays, or a couple of plays at that stage, and I had this idea about, and it was one of those ridiculous moments. I talked about where you get the ideas from. I'm in the gym working out. I'm an actor mainly still. And there I am doing shoulder lifts, right? So I'm looking at doing shoulder lifts, looking in the mirror, checking my form. And this is how my brain tends to work. So, forgive me here, but this is how it goes. And I'm looking at I'm going, God, I got a long neck. Because if I was ever executed, that'd be an easy shot for the axe or the sword, because Anne Boleyn was executed with a sword. That was it. The Frenchman with the sword coming over. And Anne Boleyn, oh yeah, and then I said, and Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on one hand. And so that became it. The French executioner would come, and she says, you've got to get rid of this. It's the mark of the witch, right? The 6-fingered hand of Anne Boleyn. It'll be used against me like they've used me all my life.